got it. All right, so I'm going to be with you the rest of the night. We're going to come up, we're going to count down the rest of the monsters. We've got a lot of surprises for you, maybe even a little giveaway, whatever. We're going to see a whole bunch of stuff. But first, I got a panel. I'm going to bring up our moderator for the first panel, Mr. Matthew Shuckman. All right, bring it up for Matthew. He's coming up over here. Yeah, okay.
Hello everybody, how's everybody doing tonight? I'm Matthew Shuckman of the Overdue Rentals podcast and writer for Den of Geek. And we're gonna, well, I'll wait for the seats to come out because I want everybody to stand for like forever. But I would like to introduce you to Mr. Mike Gingold, former editor and current writer for Fangoria and Rue Morgue, and screenwriter and longtime comic creator, especially of the X-Files comics, Joe Harris. Oh. Joe, nice to see you. So, guys, we're obviously here talking about the legacy, the lasting legacy of a show like the X-Files. But to do that, I think we got to start with how you first were introduced to the X-Files. Can you talk a little bit about the first time you saw it, how it kind of grew with you, and we'll go from there.
Well, it's interesting because at the time the X-Files came out, I was in my, I guess, maybe third year working at Fangoria, and from what we had heard of the show, it kind of sounded like something that our sister magazine, Starlog, would be more, that'd be more of their interest because it was science fiction. It didn't really seem like horror. Does anyone here remember a show called Project UFO? Few people. It was this show that was on in the late 70s, and it was a UFO of the Week show. And it was one of these things where, like, half the episodes, the UFOs turned out to be weather balloons and things like that. But anyway, when I first heard about X-Files, I thought, well, it kind of sounds like Project UFO for the 90s, and, that's kind of more Starlog's thing. And then one night, I decided to watch the show, and it was the episode Eve, which was one of the, it's got some fans. It's one of the great, what I call the bait and switch episodes, where it starts out like it's about aliens, it's about like alien mutilations, except mutilating people instead of cattle, and then it kind of turns and it becomes something else. And I was immediately intrigued by it. I love the chemistry that the two leads had. I just love the style of it. All these years later, it can be kind of hard to recall that other than perhaps Twin Peaks, there had been nothing on TV that looked like this before. So I was immediately intrigued, and I went back and was saying, we need to start covering this show, and very quickly we did.
Joe, about you?
Well, I was a teenager, quite disaffected at the time, with not much else to do on Friday night. And I guess I was right in the demographic when Fox launched. So there were all those other shows that sort of 21 Jump Street and even Herman's Head, things like that. And then the X-Files came along, and I had something to do on Friday nights. And my friends and I were with it the entire way as the buzz for the movie really started to build, and the show moved to Sunday nights and the audience started to grow. We were there. And it's just, I think it's just one of the most indelible franchises that you're likely to find anywhere.
Mike, I think it's interesting when you bring up Project UFO because, I can think, there was a lot of DNA you can take from something, though, like Twilight Zone or Tales from the Dark Side that kind of fit a little bit into the X-Files world, but there was also stuff like Kolchak the Night Stalker, and that's something that kind of, it was a cult hit, but it didn't last. Why is it something that like X-Files can last where Kolchak kind of fails?
I think the world was kind of ready for it. I mean, horror in the early 90s, there was not a lot of horror in theaters. Horror was kind of on a downswing theatrically. And I think the fact that, Friday night you could kind of get a horror fix every night at, 9 or 10 or whatever time it was aired. And again, the show went there in a way that network shows did not at the time. I don't know how many seasons in, but there was the episode Home, which got notorious as the one that they aired it once and they never aired it again, because I think they got too many complaints because it was too graphic to be shown on television. But yeah, I think it took advantage of the fact there was not a lot of other horror out there. And also it had that anchor in its two leads. I mean, most of the shows you talked about are complete anthologies, different casts and story every season. Kolchak had this continuing character, and I know that was a big influence on Chris Carter when he created the X-Files. But he was on his own, and this one had two leads who kind of played off each other and had this wonderful dynamic that hooked you into the show, in addition to having all these great creatures on it. And then, of course, you started getting the mythology build-up and the conspiracy and the ongoing arc, which no show like this had before, in part because none of them had lasted this long. So it was kind of a combination of factors that kind of made it endure over 10 or 11 or however many seasons they had.
And Joe, also, you worked a little bit with dealing with X-Files comics before the resurgence of season 10, but when season 10 came along, you were actually a little bit part of, not necessarily creating the whole storyline, but as far as the way a comic goes, you're intertwining your stories into that. Is there something special about being part of bringing these things back to life?
Well, it was a thrill for sure, and it was, when we first launched the comics, it was in a vacuum a little bit, right? Because it had been a few years since the second film, and there was a new publisher that had acquired the license, and we had worked out a take for, what would we do with the X-Files in the 21st century as fans? And it wasn't that long in the process when my publisher had a meeting at Fox, and Chris was there. And Chris Carter was very kind and generous with his advice and his blessing. And we got to do something that played at continuity, and it's almost like alternate reality X-Files, which is pretty cool. We got to resurrect the mythology with some, I think, some cool twists, and it was cool to be the only game in town for a little while. It was a lot of fun. It was an honor.
It's also interesting because when you brought up the idea that Fox was a fledgling network, when, of course, not only when X-Files started, but when you're kind of noticing a lot of these things. And, for everybody who may not know, Fox News is one thing, but Fox Entertainment Division all around was very daring, and especially when it's just starting as a channel, to be able to have the availability to kind of put stuff like X-Files out must have helped along. Do you feel that there was this idea that they had a little kind of carte blanche the way that other shows didn't get, and that's what kind of helped push it along?
I mean, I think the sex appeal pushed it along as much as anything, right? The charisma. It's the first thing people talk about with me when they stop by to talk X-Files. It's either what it is about Agent Mulder or Agent Scully that endures, and those sparks, that chemistry, the respect that they had for one another, and the tension, I think, that came naturally. I think that's what really pushed it along.
Now, Mike, I understand that you had a classmate at one time when you were at NYU by the name of Vince Gilligan.
Yes, I went to NYU Film School, and Vince Gilligan was in one of my script writing classes. And we would read our own scripts in the class, and he was reading his. He read a script that he wrote called Carolina Shook, which I hope someone makes one day because it's one of the funniest things I've ever heard in my life. He started out doing comedy, which might seem strange now because he's known as the heavy dramatic guy, but anyway, yeah, it was great because years later I'm working at Fango and I'm watching X-Files, and there's Vince's name coming up, so I got to call him up and say, "Hey Vince, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm working at Fangoria now. We'd love to do an interview," and we did. We tried to interview as many people as we could from the show. Like every season when they'd have new writers or new other people come in, we really tried to do as much coverage as we could. In part, like I said, there were not a lot of features to cover, so X-Files was this kind of gift that kept on giving because there were so many different ways to cover it.
Well, and then again, covering it, like you said, bringing horror to TV that way wasn't kind of done before, or done in that exact way. Do you feel that you can see, not only see the effect it's had on current TV from then, but do you feel that it actually had a current effect on horror as a whole, even back then?
Yeah, I think, and what you're saying before about it being on Fox as a fledgling network, there was a sense that they could try to kind of get away with things that the other networks couldn't, and I think that was a big influence for Buffy the Vampire Slayer when the WB put that out, and they were going places that horror never had before. So, and there have been countless movies. There have been a lot of kind of low-budget alien conspiracy movies, and they all have that same kind of look, the same kind of dark, moody You didn't really see that on television before, even on horror shows. You didn't see this kind of great atmosphere that the X-Files had. So yeah, I think it definitely had an impact on TV, but also in feature films as well.
And for creating the comics, Joe, is it stuff that where you had to go back, rewatch, reinvent yourself with the show a little bit because you had to get used to the idea of what those feelings were and putting it down, or you got to also inject your own kind of feeling into things compared to what maybe was told to you?
Well, I mean, I did it after well, maybe a little even before I got the gig, I did a deep dive back into the catalog. And one of my favorite things was to find little throwaways, people's names that would come up once, never come up again. Little tidbits that we could then build out into stories that had not just an obvious connection to the past, but kind of adoringly tried to breathe something out of there. Like, off the top of my head, a good example I can think of is in the pilot, they mention a serial killer, Monty Props. And I don't think the character's name was ever brought up again, and we made him the villain in the Millennium series we eventually did that spun out of the X-Files comics. And there were a lot of little bits like that. That's where I got a charge.
I think it's funny also that you mentioned the idea of names that don't come up again, because, and not to take anything away from the X-Files, because that's what we're here about tonight, but I was doing the same thing. I was rewatching recently, and I think there's a season 6 episode, and going back to Vince, of course, there's somebody on the phone and says, "Have you spoken to Miss Ermintrout?" And I was just like, does he reuse that name everywhere he goes? I don't know. But beyond that, was there a certain part of the show that was more, like Martin Monster was saying, there's the alien side and there's the monster of the week side. Was there a side of it that appealed to you more?
I think the conspiracy is closer to my heart. I loved the way those early seasons would end. I loved those cliffhangers from Mulder in the train to season 3 finale is one of my all-time favorite episodes too. I just thought that it was they did such a masterful job of doing something that hadn't been done before, and how many times have you seen it imitated since? So it to me, the monster episodes are brilliant, and I'm a fan of a lot of the same ones. I'm sure you are. But the conspiracy is special, and that just I'm very dear in terms of that. I'm very fond of it.
Mike, I don't want to assume that it would be the monster side for you, but what side would you go with?
Oh, monsters for sure. And and the stuff like Home, which does that count as monsters? It's kind of like weird people. I guess they're monsters also. But I'm also a big fan of kind of the quirky ones that would show up every so often. I remember one that made a huge impression was Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, which that was the one where I kind of convinced Tony Timpone and Fango that he needed to start watching this. I came in, I was like, man, the X-Files last night, it was this great episode with Peter Boyle, which was another thing, because back at that time, movie actors did not do series TV very often. You didn't get the crossover that you have today. So the fact that they had Peter Boyle coming in and doing an episode was really notable. But yeah, I love it when they would kind of go kind of off book in a sense and do something very odd and weird and wonderful like Clyde Bruckman. I love, and that was the great thing about tuning in, because you never knew what you were going to get. You didn't know if you were going to get another chapter in the conspiracy or a really cool new monster or something from entirely out of left field. I also love the one, and I can't remember the title, but it's the one where, spoiler alert, I guess, it's the one where it turns out people are being absorbed by this fungus that was giving them hallucinations as they were dying. That's a great because it's another great bait and switch episode, and I just love that one too.
Well, again, this is now going into not only the things that influence the X-Files, but of course the X-Files. I kind of hate using the term the X-Files walked so these things could run, because the X-Files ran on its own. But the idea that things like Fringe and Supernatural probably couldn't exist without the success of the X-Files.
Oh, absolutely not, no.
Do you feel, though, that in some ways, and I'm not trying to take anything away from those shows, everybody, if you're fans as well, but in some ways that almost like, it's almost a copycat kind of feeling?
Well, I don't know if Supernatural is necessarily. It's got a somewhat different vibe to it. There were lots of these kind of scientific investigation shows where you had people out investigating, and some were good, like Fringe, and some were not so good. So we did get some good shows out of that whole trend, certainly.
Do you think that there is, because again, we're watching the X-Files come back time and again. It's not going away, and thank God it's not going away. But in a lot of ways, do you feel that it's now maybe, it's a monopoly in a lot of ways? Or not?
I think it's just one of those shows that's going to endure as kind of just as an inspiration for so much to come later. The way every slasher movie nowadays can still trace its roots back to Halloween or earlier to Psycho. There are many different ways to do variations on it. You can do that subject in so many different ways, and the X-Files is just going to kind of stand as like, the standard bearer, the standard creator, the one where it kind of all got started.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. It's wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you for coming.
Take us away. And,